everybody. KMO here. I want to talk to you about conspiracy theories. I'd like to propose a voluntary moratorium on the use of the phrase conspiracy theory as a way of dismissing potential explanations for events. Not only is routine use of this phrase disrespectful and intellectually lazy, but it might even be dangerous. We use the phrase far too routinely as a thought stopper, by which I mean as an excuse to skip over analytical due diligence and leap to a premature conclusion, rather than consider whether an event benefited some privileged group, and whether that group had the means or the inclination to act in secret to achieve something that is good for them, but bad for society. We can just wave away the whole question and call it a conspiracy theory, and spare ourselves the bother of thinking. The phrase doubles as an insult because only socially inept losers with no lives concern themselves with conspiracies, right? This is a simple categorize and dismiss move, which makes us feel both smart and superior, when the exact opposite is the case. I think we can all agree that some conspiracies exist. For example, the US government regularly charges people with the crime of conspiracy, and lots of people languishing in prison today are there not because they stole anything, or killed anyone, or committed acts of espionage or terrorism. No, they are in prison because they talked with someone else about stealing, spying, killing, or committing acts of terror. That's what it means to conspire, to plan an unlawful or harmful act. Obviously, people do conspire, and those conspiracies have had enormous impacts on our world. World War I started when a Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip shot and killed the Archduke Ferdinand and his wife as they toured the city of Sarajevo in an open car. This was not a spontaneous act, nor was it the work of a so-called lone gunman. Princip had conspired with a group of Serbs who hated the fact that their people and their country were subjects of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and they conspired to assassinate the heir to the imperial throne. The resulting World War killed millions of people and set up the conditions for the start of the Second World War 20 years later, which would kill millions more people, and then set the stage for the Cold War. The fallout from that conspiracy in Sarajevo held the whole world hostage to the threat of nuclear annihilation for decades. That tiny conspiracy had effects which rippled forward in time and shaped the geopolitics of the 20th century. Now, at this point, you're probably saying, well, that's not what we mean when we say conspiracy theory. Yes, that conspiracy of Serbs had an enormous impact, but that's just the butterfly effect in action. None of those Serbian conspirators were powerful people. When we talk about conspiracy theories in the modern sense, we mean something orchestrated by powerful people or institutions, usually conducted over long periods of time and which achieve uncanny levels of success. It's true. Those are the kinds of conspiracies that people tend to worry about today. But that hasn't always been the case. Prior to the two world wars of the 20th century, many conspiracy theories in the United States focused not on the powerful, but on the powerless. Of course, the fear that the Jews are conspiring against the Gentiles is nothing new, nor even uniquely American. But not only did Americans worry about the protocols of the learned elders of Zion, we harbored paranoia about the conspiracies of slaves, and later ex-slaves, as well as various sorts of immigrants. You might wonder how anyone could get bent out of shape worrying about what the powerless people of the world are conspiring to do. I think the fiction of H.P. Lovecraft provides an illuminating example of the pre-war mentality about the dangers posed by the dregs of society. In his story, The Horror at Red Hook, Lovecraft tells the story of a New York City police detective named Malone. In the story, Detective Malone uncovered the secret and nefarious doings of a degenerate people living in a waterfront neighborhood of Brooklyn called Red Hook. Malone, an obvious stand-in for the author, is a sensitive soul who detects a sort of atavistic corruption at work in Red Hook, a place where several breeds of dark-skinned, non-English-speaking foreigners live cheek by jowl. Lovecraft writes, "To Malone, the sense of latent mystery in existence was always present. In youth, he had felt the hidden beauty and ecstasy of things, and had been a poet. But poverty and sorrow and exile had turned his gaze in darker directions, and he had thrilled at the imputations of evil in the world around. Daily life had, for him, become a phantasmagoria of macabre shadow studies. Malone was satisfied to let his notions remain as half-spied, forbidden visions to be lightly played with, and hysteria came only when duty flung him into a hell of revelation too sudden and insidious to escape. He had, for some time, been detailed to the Butler Street station in Brooklyn when the Red Hook matter came to his notice. Red Hook is a maze of hybrid squalor near the ancient waterfront opposite Governor's Island. The population is a hopeless tangle and enigma. Syrian, Spanish, Italian, and Negro elements impinging upon one another, and fragments of Scandinavian and American belts lying not far distant. It is a babel of sound and filth, and sends out strange cries to answer the lapping of oily waves at its grimy piers and the monstrous organ litanies of the harbor whistles. Malone found in this state of things a faint stench of secrets more terrible than any of the sins denounced by citizens and bemoaned by priests and philanthropists. He was conscious, as one who united imagination with scientific knowledge, that modern people, under lawless conditions, tend uncannily to repeat the darkest instinctive patterns of primitive half-ape savagery in their daily life and ritual observances. And he had often viewed, with an anthropologist's shudder, the chanting, cursing processions of blear-eyed and pockmarked young men which wound their way along in the dark, small hours of morning. One saw groups of these youths incessantly, sometimes in leering vigils on street corners, sometimes in doorways, playing eerily on cheap instruments of music, sometimes in stupefied dozes or indecent dialogues around cafeteria tables near Borough Hall, and sometimes in whispering converse around dingy taxicabs drawn up at the high stoops of crumbling and closely shuttered old houses. They chilled and fascinated him more than he dared confess to his associates on the force, for he seemed to see in them some monstrous thread of secret continuity, some fiendish, cryptical, and ancient pattern utterly beyond and below the sordid mass of facts and habits and haunts listed with such conscientious technical care by the police. They must be, he felt inwardly, the heirs of some shocking and primordial tradition, the sharers of debased and broken scraps from cults and ceremonies older than mankind. Yes, you might say, it's always fun to read Lovecraft, but again, this misses the point. We're talking about conspiracy theories as they exist today, in the early 21st century, not the paranoid, though entertaining, racial status panic of a New England xenophobe in 1921. So let's get back to the real world, shall we? Okay, how's this for real world? In 1961, when President Dwight D. Eisenhower left office, he gave a farewell address which contained the following warning. A vital element in keeping the peace is our military establishment. Our arms must be mighty, ready for instant action, so that no potential aggressor may be tempted to risk his own destruction. American makers of plowshares could, with time and as required, make swords as well. But now we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. This conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. From that time up until the present day, the United States would spend more on the military each year than it did during World War II. This permanent wartime economy generated billions of dollars in private fortunes and created structures of unelected political power. Do you think the military-industrial complex just happened? Surely some of the people on the receiving end of all that money and influence saw the potential for personal enrichment and met with their associates to discuss how to make it happen. Isn't it reasonable to assume that at least some of those conversations took place not in open hearings, but in closed-door meetings? Or do you hold that the Joint Chiefs, the big military contractors, and the members of Congress who brought enormous amounts of money home to their districts just stumbled blindly and innocently into these windfalls? You don't think there's a conspiracy there? Really? Does President Eisenhower fit your mental image of a conspiracy theorist? Do you think that he moved out of the White House and into his mother's basement? Maybe you're thinking that to be a conspiracy, the conspirators had to plan to commit a crime, and that the creation of a permanent war economy was perfectly legal. Crucifying humanity on a cross of iron is a crime, and planning to commit that crime with other people who will profit from it is a criminal conspiracy. At this point, you might be saying, okay, fine. There are conspiracies, and sometimes they involve powerful people and affect millions, but that's not what we mean when we shut down some ridiculous, paranoid delusion by calling it a conspiracy theory. It was historians, professional investigators, and actual journalists who brought those big conspiracies into the public view, not some pimply-faced loser doing research from his mother's basement. That's what we're talking about when we dismiss some man-child's half-baked Machiavellian fantasy about secret cabals and furtive networks of power as a conspiracy theory. Ah, good. Now we're getting somewhere. So when we ridicule someone's ideas as conspiracy theories, we're not really criticizing their evidence or reasoning so much as we're ridiculing their mental and emotional development and their social status. Let's skip over the fact that this is an example of an ad hominem attack, which is a way to avoid analyzing an argument by attacking the person making it. In formal debates, this is a no-no, but in the real world, we can't afford to waste our time listening to losers and lunatics. We need to be on the lookout for dysfunctional people, spot them early, and shut them down before they waste our time, or worse, infect us with their social defects. Like William Burroughs put it in his Words of Advice for Young People, "Do not offer sympathy to the mentally ill. Tell them firmly, I'm not paid to listen to this drivel." Here, let me just say that I agree. It's not a good idea to follow anybody to Crazy Town or let them drag us there. It doesn't take long reading internet forums devoted to various types of conspiracy theory to see that many of the most impassioned participants are not quite right in the head. It's easy to imagine that they gravitate to discussions of secret societies, privileged bloodlines, and secret government alliances with extraterrestrials because their lives, to put it charitably, are unfulfilling. If they had rewarding careers, healthy romantic relationships, or the social skills that would allow them to connect meaningfully with the people around them, then they would not obsess over dark and unprovable conspiracies. And to build on that, I'd like to go back to that Lovecraft excerpt from The Horror at Red Hook. To Malone, the sense of latent mystery in existence was always present. In youth, he had felt the hidden beauty and ecstasy of things, and had been a poet. But poverty and sorrow and exile had turned his gaze in darker directions, and he had thrilled at the imputations of evil in the world around. To say that somebody doesn't have a life, that they are a loser, that they have nothing better to do than obsess over esoteric nonsense with like-minded geeks, is a cruel way of describing the difference between so-called normal people and artists, or shamans. Normal people are satisfied to focus on work, shopping, status competitions, mainstream entertainment, and sports. Creative types are unsatisfied with these mundane concerns. They look at the world and feel the hidden beauty and ecstasy of things. But if treated badly by those around them and forced to retreat inward and erect psychological defenses, that sense of hidden beauty and ecstasy can turn into a dark obsession. Like Detective Malone, they begin to thrill at the imputations of evil in the world around. I'm sure you'll object that you have nothing against artists, but by this I take you to mean that you have nothing against successful artists. Creative people who are successful, wealthy, famous, charming, or good-looking are fine to have around. But not everybody with an artistic soul has the opportunities, the social support, or the self-discipline to develop their talents into a viable artistic career. Many an artistic soul is forced to eke out a living and social existence in a world made by and for mundane thinkers with prosaic concerns. It's no surprise that such people would look around and see a world ruled by money, shallow celebrity, vanity, cruelty, and inane entertainment and conclude that the world couldn't be this screwed up by accident. Surely this world bears the signature of some malevolent author. The two primary survival tools that evolution has given to human beings are our ability for cooperative action and our facility for pattern recognition. Show us a field of random dots and we will connect them to reveal a hidden image. Our instincts served us well when we lived in groups no larger than 150 members, but in sprawling industrial societies where we interact on a social scale more appropriate to a swarm of insects, our tendency to find meaningful patterns within random data can lead us astray. We see dangers that aren't there, or we magnify or misinterpret their significance. Professor Robert A. Goldberg described the thinking of the conspiracy-minded as follows. Here is the general scenario. Hidden groups, intelligent, diabolical, and cunning, move and shape American history. Financial catastrophes, assassinations, terrorism, and deceit are their means. Wealth and power are their ends. Nothing is random or the matter of coincidence. Conspiracy theorists give no credence to chance, bureaucratic process, or miscalculation. For the conspiracy-minded, everything can be explained. All the dots can be connected. Their world is coherent and ordered, with a vengeance. Their world is void of mistakes, ambiguities, and misunderstandings. For them, the devil is always in the details. So what's my point? That we should be kind to the poor, unfortunate souls who have nothing better to do with their lives than obsess over cryptic continuities and hints of malevolent authorship in the world? Yeah, the golden rule is all well and good, but you have to admit, some people are so pathetic. They seem like they were made to be bullied. We're not all saints, you know. Our ability to treat conspiracy nerds like normal people only extends so far. But what if there was an element of self-interest in showing those pitiable souls more consideration than you feel like doing? Because there's one other aspect to conspiracy theories that I'd like to bring to your attention. Robert Anton Wilson wrote, "All conspiracy buffs are persecuted eventually. This is a sociological law on which I would stake my life, because I have seen it confirmed in every conspiracy-seeking group I've ever known. Perhaps the persecution is created by the conspiracy seekers themselves, in the sense that every neurotic creates his own problems. Or perhaps the mad satire in Illuminatus is true after all, and every conspiracy ever imagined actually exists. The fact remains that those who believe the world is run by Jesuits get persecuted as much as those who believe it is run by the Elders of Zion. And those who believe it is run by the Rockefellers get persecuted in exactly equal measure. People who believe the Air Force is deliberately hiding the facts about the UFOs get persecuted by a special group of sinister beings known as the Men in Black, who claim to be Air Force officers, but who are, naturally, denied by the Air Force. There almost seems to be a neurotic psionic law. Whatever you fear most will eventually come after you. Get that? Even if you believe in some conspiracy, and many conspiracy theories are now quite mainstream, like the controversy over Barack Obama's birth certificate, you probably don't believe in every conspiracy. It may seem obvious to you that President John F. Kennedy was not killed by a lone assassin, but that doesn't mean that you believe that the world is run by trans-dimensional, shape-shifting reptiles. But Uncle Bob tells us that it doesn't matter what the conspiracy theorists believe. The object of their paranoia will manifest itself in their lives and persecute them. There are many variations on the conspiracy theme that non-material and malevolent entities exist which feed on human suffering. Some call them flyers, others psychic vampires. Whatever we call them, they exert their influence on human beings and persuade them to make the choices that create a world conducive to human suffering. If the conspiracy theorist, in the modern, prejudicial sense of the word, is a natural shaman, bent toward darkness by human cruelty, and if their creativity is invested in diabolical fantasies which then find material form and further torment them, then the world of human experience could be caught in a vicious feedback loop whereby human cruelty gives rise to dark obsessions, which in turn find just enough material instantiation to visit further misery on those same creative minds. Each iteration of this feedback loop prompts these shamanic apopheniacs to find even darker and more demonic forms in the chaotic turmoil of our human societies. If that were the case, then I would not be speaking metaphorically if I were to tell you that denigrating so-called conspiracy theorists, calling them losers, human rejects, living in their mother's basements well into adulthood, that such acts of unthinking habitual cruelty bring new material horrors into the world, which will inevitably find their way to your door. I'm not saying be good for goodness sake. I'm not talking about karma. I'm telling you that the people you ridicule as losers, nerds, dorks, and conspiracy theorists have powers that you don't have. They don't know how to use their powers, and by being cruel to them, you are prompting them to use their powers in dark and destructive ways. The example of the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand demonstrates how the dark and violent obsessions of a few nobodies can bring death and destruction, fear and misery to millions of people just like you. The suffering of the sensitive, artistic soul may be sweeter to the malevolent entities that hover just outside the range of our senses, but when that feedback loop really gets rolling, the resulting wave of human misery engulfs artists and the sports fans alike.